Welcome back to another episode of Re-Correlated Podcast. We are your hosts, Natalie and Mac. We do not have Hollis back yet this week, but that is okay. And we are here with a very awesome guest, someone I've gotten to work closely with. Mac, you've gotten to work closely with. So one of our favorite people, Lloyd Evans. He is currently the VP of GRC, but Lloyd, I know that does not do your background enough justice. So go ahead, give us the rundown. Tell us who you are, what your background is, all of that.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here. You two are like some of the best people I've worked with, so I appreciate you having me on. I'm Lloyd Evans. I started my career in the Air Force, so I'm an Air Force veteran. I was doing logistics, which isn't really what I wanted, and then kind of found myself through, I guess, like a happenstance almost into a cybersecurity internship. I had actually originally wanted to go into aerospace engineering, and so I got like kind of through like serendipitous chance. I've met the first person on my base out of the Air Force who had pioneered kind of the internship process. It was at an engineering company, and I was like, I'll do anything. I don't really know where I'm headed. So it's at an engineering company. I can talk to the aerospace people. Turns out it was a cybersecurity internship. They let me play around for 6 months on like a ton of old servers. So I got to do the whole like sysadmin like experience crunched into a very short time frame. I was the only intern, so there was like tons of people just like kind of pouring their knowledge into me. I was like studying, Professor Messer's Sec Plus videos, cutting my own Cat5 cables, setting up servers, set up like Snort and everything on that. And then just, kind of separated from the Air Force after that and kind of just found my own way. So I did some contracting for the Navy, moved across the country twice, made my way to finally to a software factory within the U.S. Air Force that was one of the original pioneers of continuous authority to operate. And then from there, I made my way to Acquia. I started here as a principal information system security officer for a platform as a service within the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare. And then I worked my way up to director of GRC, and then now I'm the vice president of GRC. So hopefully that's a little bit about me.
Those pesky internships, they get their claws in you, then you're in.
Yeah. And I thought it was great. I was like learning all this stuff and I was like, oh, this is pretty cool. I thought it was Mr. Robot and everything. And then it wasn't until I like Googled like the salary of like, what does an ISO make? And I was like, oh, this is what I'm doing for the next foreseeable future.
This is forever. Yeah, I'm in. I'm in. Sign me up. Just where do I put my name? That's awesome.
That's so great.
I love the idea of like studying to like laying the foundation to be an ISO, but also cutting your own Cat5 cable. Like that is just, you got the whole breadth of the spectrum, which is awesome.
Yeah, it was great. I feel like that knowledge like really helped me like learning cloud and stuff. It was like, oh, like I can kind of like physically almost like equate certain things. It was like really helpful learning that.
You're the Queen's Gambit. You're just watching the game up on the ceiling. You can picture how the data is flowing and it just gives you all the context you need.
Yeah, except maybe half the time the picture's wrong. So yeah.
All right. Well, so I didn't know that you actually did not come from a technical MOS either. You were doing more, you said logistics management and stuff like that. So that's kind of cool because like I've actually probably know more people in cyber that came from like odd specialties within like the military than like actually came from like a technical like MOS or job skill set. So it's kind of cool. So we are here today to talk about GRC engineering, what it is. So Lloyd, what is GRC engineering, and how do you see GRC engineering being our pivot forward for how we lead in GRC and actually fulfill the technical requirements?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that the shortest story I could probably describe this. So in kind of getting that position as a principal ISO for that platform, the platform is completely new and we're building it from the ground up. And so as we were going through and choosing kind of the tooling stack that we were going to use, creating like our initial architecture decision records for things like the pipeline, the infrastructure, how we were going to set up a like inheritance model on top of all the cloud services that we were going to be using. My job was to get us an authority to operate, which is within the federal government, basically just kind of the piece of paper that you need to say you are authorized to run the system within the federal government. Every system that runs within any branch of the federal government needs an authority to operate. And it is kind of starts to get into some of the more boring compliance stuff of fulfilling FISMA requirements, if you've kind of heard that thrown around. And basically, there's a ton of work that goes into this, both in time and in just manual effort. And so coming in, I was net new to the agency to Centers of Medicaid and Medicare, coming in to kind of build this ATO. I'd done this previously, but never within this context. And so I was learning kind of what their different like flavor of NIST 853 was, getting kind of the control baseline for a moderate system that we needed to put together. And then quickly started breaking ground on working directly with our engineering teams of saying, hey, we're using XYZ for our SaaS DAS scanner. How does that relate to the NIST 853 controls we need to do? And we needed to move through this very, very quickly. And it was through the traditional ATO process, which if you've ever been through it is just a mountain of paperwork, Excel files, old kind of legacy GRC systems that kind of like, they don't really have API functionality. It's like purely just like a document repository essentially. And I started to realize like very quickly that, we were doing all of this kind of work to get our ATO. We ended up getting, fast forward to the end, we ended up getting one of the fastest ATOs within CMS history, and then had a flawless system security plan on top of that. That definitely wasn't just me. There was a whole team that, poured their heart and soul into getting to that state. But along the way, I couldn't help but notice that like tons of the work that we were doing was just extremely like static, point in time. And my job kind of as the security officer maintaining all of our documentation was figuring out a way of like, I'm writing all of this stuff for how we do all of this architecture, but like I'm also like embedded with the engineering team so I can see how fast we're changing all of this stuff. Like something doesn't really like equate here, and I can like manually change in this like particular statement for how we do our audit logs based off of a change that's come through. But like that makes me a point of failure. Like if I left and trained someone else, like that person then immediately becomes a point of failure and has none of the knowledge for like building this in the first place. And I also saw this with, as a platform as a service, all of our customers that were applications on top of the platform were experiencing all these same pain points. So quickly, working with a lot of engineers that were much smarter than me, I quickly started to find ways to be able to tie the ATO requirements that we have to meet these in order to be able to ship software within the federal government to actual tangible engineering and security engineering related things that we were doing as a part of the platform. For that particular program, we did things, in an opinionated sort of way, but a lot of this I kind of just started describing as like GRC engineering, and that started blading into assessments, how we were doing like as code security impact assessments, and kind of generally just reframing how things were done in a way that made sense for development processes. And little did I know that there's a ton of other people that have kind of reached these same conclusions that I've started to meet with as well, ever since kind of just starting to talk about this.
And GRC engineering, Lloyd, is kind of, like you said, sort of this new term coming up. Your meme game on LinkedIn is fire, and you're talking a lot about GRC engineering and GRC automation. And I think, it's an interesting kind of story that you're telling. The three of us kind of coming in to cybersecurity through like the compliance background. And I think the traditional way, Natalie and I have talked about this on the podcast before, like GRC is kind of that low barrier of entry because it's documents and it's compliance and it's Excel spreadsheets. I love the idea of you seeing maybe a field of cybersecurity that's kind of, I've seen a lot of people talk about how it's been left in the wake of modernization and automation and kind of this new wave of how we're embracing AI, ML, and all of this. And you saw that need immediately as you were looking through this authority to operate program. How do you get this kind of antiquated legacy approach to compliance, risk, and governance, and how do you bring modernity to that? So, talk a little bit about breaking ground in that, because it is interesting. You were literally embedded with engineers, and that was the way that you went through. But that is a microcosm. How does that look on a global scale?
Yeah, I love this question because I've had some feedback on my meme game of like people who think that like this is how like GRC should always be done, or like, hey, this is like what I'm doing here. And like I think all of those things are great, but like on the actual ground level, like that is not at all how I've seen GRC shake out. Like the traditional way that I've seen GRC shake out is that you have a kind of a non-technical ISO person that's in charge of doing all the documents that I was in charge of. That person is like brought in very quickly to write a bunch of material as fast as possible, and then they're like shelved until the next assessment comes up in a year, and then for the reassessment in 3 years, while the engineer team does like all of the actual work. And this kind of this model like doesn't really work well for either party. On the engineer side, they kind of are frustrated with all of these kind of heavy-handed requirements and like these just, the system that we were going through had 352 individual controls, which broke out into like 780 line item control implementation statements that we had to do for a platform. Like an engineering team that's trying to ship and develop software like cares about none of these things. But then an ISO is trying to, make sure that they even can like ship code in the first place. And so they need to be able to, work somewhat with the engineering team. And it's kind of like a tough relationship. And so one of the things that I would say that I would kind of credit our team with doing really well is, and this kind of goes into that, what I would describe as GRC engineering is from the GRC side, distilling down all of the just really, frankly, boring, like kind of dry compliance requirements, and really distilling exactly what's needed from the engineering side and doing as much pre-work as possible. Like there were tons of tools that I was never familiar with coming into this particular platform that I had to immediately like spin up. Where it's like, all right, this afternoon, I know nothing about this DAS scanner or this like malware scanner that we're using, or at least maybe I know like the capability, but I don't know the particular tool. Let me like read the documentation, figure out like what best questions to ask, and then really not waste the engineers' time as much as possible. And that really built up a ton of rapport with the engineering team, where they were like, you mean you're not coming at us with like basic questions of like, what is EC2? It's like, no, we were like trying to figure out like exactly how we were doing, service control policies, like our CloudTrail, CloudWatch for audit and logging. Like we were coming through like, how are these things configured, and understanding also too, like what they were saying in a way that we could then, take all of that information and then do all the kind of GRC work that we needed to do. And I think that's kind of bled into a realization on my part that at some point, from the GRC side, there's an ownership that can be taken where it's like, well, if you can just understand how to, kind of develop these capabilities yourself and be able to like sling code a little bit, or at the very least be able to, set up like an automated assessment using something like Audit Manager and AWS, like you can start to do all these things with even more limited interaction from the engineering team. And I say it that way, but it's almost from that legacy sense, whereas like in the GRC engineering sense, you're almost becoming an embedded member that's like actually valuable and functioning within the engineering team, which really decreases a lot of that original tension. But all of this requires, I would argue, a strong onus on the GRC person to grow themselves as an engineer and be able to, really kind of prove themselves with engineering teams. And I really feel that that's kind of the future direction of our field.
Well, that's kind of what we're always saying as GRC folks, right? Is that our job is to help. We're not here to tell you can't do something, but that's tough. Like you're saying, when you've written a bunch of documentation, a product is being built, and then at the end, you're trying to kind of make ends meet. If you're embedded and you're saying, hey, green light, go, or like, hey, yellow light, we got to look at this control, make sure that you're building it this way. It takes away that combative nature of like when the compliance person, when the risk person comes by, you're going to get told that you can't do something you want to do. I love that idea. Natalie?
Yeah, I absolutely would agree with that. Like, think it's so important to have technical skills and to put that onus, and you said you have to take the onus on yourself, and to put that onus on you, and to take that next step into doing that research and continuously going out and being like, okay, well, what does this actually mean? Like, how do I how do I figure that? Let's figure it out. Let's go. And like a lot of times it comes from like stepping into a position a little early and then just being like, okay, well, we're going to sink or swim. So let's start swimming, start paddling. Let's go. So I think that's really great that you highlight that as well, because I think it's also really important to kind of reflect on the leadership side a little bit of senior team members kind of taking their juniors under the wing and showing them like, hey, this is what I'm expecting you to do. Like lead them to swimming on their own too. Right.
Yeah, 100%. I would say, if you're in I kind of split up leadership between positional power and inspirational power. And I think, anyone can kind of deploy inspirational power wherever they're at, even if they're, a fresh intern. But then, for leaders that have positional power that like oversee teams, especially on the GRC side, I'd say not only kind of taking that ownership on yourself to upskill, but then also empowering like people underneath you to move in that direction as well. I think the days are very numbered for kind of the almost like a learned helplessness within GRC, where it's like, I need people to do things for me for my job to be effective. I think that's not a winning formula for the future.
And it's always great when you can go into an audit and you can just help a client out and be like, oh no, we want to go into this console and pull this up. And they're like, oh, okay, cool, thanks. And you're like, yeah. And then we're going to go in here, we're going to screenshot this for them. Okay, cool. Go ahead, Mac.
I was going to say, drilling down on leadership just a little bit more, though, because I know, Lloyd, that's something that you are really passionate about. Taking it from, because, I think what's so exciting about what you did for CMS is being that kind of like worker leader that saw a problem, was willing to put himself out there and work for a solution, and was able to spin something up faster and better than it had been done. Take that and expand it. Talk to us a little bit about what you think this next wave of cyber leadership, because we've as a nation, our leadership is going to be shifting, and we've got a lot of federal agencies that are in flux. We've got a lot of industry that's in flux. I'd love to hear a little bit about your leadership brand and what you think the future is going to hold.
Yeah. So I guess first off with some definitions. So there's tons of people that are successful within kind of the GRC space. What I have found to be successful is a kind of like a blend of like three little like concentric circles. One is the technical skills, kind of as we've talked. Two is the compliance knowledge. And I would almost describe it as like a compliance stomach, right? Like there's a lot of engineers that are brilliant people that have zero interest whatsoever in anything compliance related, because it's boring. I'm not quite sure what like the food analogy would be, but maybe like plain white rice or like something similar. You got to have like the stomach for that. And then the third
kale.
Circle.
It's the kale.
Yeah.
For sure.
Unseasoned kale with water. And then the third part is like the leadership part, which I would say encompasses like your soft skills, your and a lot of people like misunderstand, I think, when I say this. Like this isn't like being a leader is like being someone that like other people, you're telling other people what to do, or that like you always know what to do, or that you're like this, person of authority. Like how I see and define leadership is a lot more of that kind of inspirational power that I mentioned earlier, which is like the ability to, kind of like just resonate with someone, kind of, even if you're, from two totally different backgrounds, like build rapport, understand, that they're like their own person. And even if they're doing things that are, maybe even counterproductive to the group as a whole, like why they're doing certain things, like everyone has a very understandable story. So then, kind of, like in the platform that we're working in, I was very conscious, I think, throughout my time there to always, see people as like a web of just people that are all like moving in the same direction. And if there's someone new added to that web, I'd reach out personally and at least, extend like a personal message, like introduce myself, hopefully maybe set up a one-on-one. We could kind of, figure out, a little bit more about each other. And I always felt like that very much helped me, because I could always kind of know one, I had like a mental picture of the org chart, for the whole kind of program, not just kind of what was on paper, but how things were actually working. You kind of knew who was doing a lot of the heavy lifting, and you kind of knew who to like talk to get certain things unstuck. But then also, the best way to build that rapport with people is to also just do really good work. I think that was like one of the plays that I kept, telling our team to do there was like, do really good work and then share it out. Don't do really good work in a silo that only you're kind of like sitting there in the corner of the room. Like they don't know all the stuff we've done, like don't do that. Like definitely like, advocate for yourself and like what your team's doing. But then also, if you're not getting the traction that you really want, like I always kind of defaulted on, is our work compelling enough? Like, are we doing it at a high enough level? And I think a lot of the things that we went through were made easier because we were, operating at a pretty high level. So, and that always starts with you, whether you're the intern, the mid-level person, kind of like the leader at like an executive level, that tone is always set by you. It can't really be set by anyone else. And you can't really ask it to be set by anyone else.
I love that.
Yeah, I agree. So how do you find like an opportunity to get into GRC engineering? Like how do you find that opportunity if you're not in a technically or if you're not in a GRC role, maybe you want to expand those GRC skills, or maybe you are and you want to get into that engineering aspect. How do you find that opportunity where you're at currently and like kind of expand that into your future realm of goals?
Yep. I would say everyone that works within a GRC in a GRC role from like entry level to higher up has the opportunity right now to start to expand their capabilities into GRC engineering. It just depends on looking at the way that we looked at it, right, was we are operating a platform that needs to be able to maximize the responsibility and inheritance that we're offering to applications on our platform. So in that context, we had a number of constraints that we had to work with. And it's like, all right, like we can do all these things manually, yes, but like, why should we have to? Like, let's find ways to be able to engineer and automate certain things, whether we're talking about, assessments or, the kind of the security impact assessments that I mentioned. Let's find a better way to go about this than just accepting kind of the traditional processes given. Those opportunities can be found in any GRC role. It just depends. It just kind of, again, on that ownership piece, instead of thinking through it as like a process to fulfill slightly faster, take an engineering approach, take some, kind of time aside, like grow your engineering skills, like any good, kind of person that is in an engineering capacity, and be able to just, kind of take one thing, one small bite, work through a POC. And then if you don't know, like ask, I feel like just asking, like if you are a GRC person in a GRC role, asking about how to engineer something better, you will almost always find a resounding like happiness in response.
Can confirm.
Agreed. Yes, absolutely. Because especially when it comes to like an audit, it is a huge undertaking task. Like when you're like moving into your auditing time, because you have to collect artifacts and you have to collect them fast, and you have to get those artifacts turned over in a timely manner. So like it's a matter of like some companies being able to like easily continuously grab those artifacts and some not. So talking more about like ATOs, what's the difference between continuous ATO and an ATO, like a regular ATO, and like what's the difference between that, like an ATO and doing your ConMon versus like a continuous ATO?
Yep. So the software factory I worked in with the Air Force was kind of one of the inaugural programs that ushered in kind of the continuous ATO cycle. And then I'm also working to implement continuous authority to operate, kind of that transition within a federal agency currently in my delivery role at the moment. And I guess I want to preface this with a couple things. One, that I'm like very much standing on the shoulders of giants here. So I would say I'm by no means the most like expert person here. I just learned from the people who are. And then, two, what I would say is like there's a lot of there's a lot of history and lore here. And so I think no matter what kind of position you take, there's going to be sensitivities, I guess, on kind of how you speak about things. So with those two things being acknowledged, the way that I've best heard it described is that a continuous ATO is fulfilling the risk management framework or RMF controls that systems have to adhere to within the federal government in almost like a better, more modern way that really builds off of kind of the DevOps movement, pushing code through pipelines, using pipelines as kind of the arbiter of what enters to production, and then also kind of tying in with environments, your cloud security best practices, securing environments to the level that need to be secured, pulling all of those kind of the data feeds that represent the risk posture of that environment into the data that is the central kind of data that comprises the decision for an authority to operate. And it is moving away from, for those of you who may not know, an authority to operate is you kind of go through, it's like months even. So like, for faster agencies, 3 to 6 months. For some other agencies, it could be like 8, 9, 10, even 11 months that it takes to get an authority to operate and even start to serve users in production. After you get that ATO, then you have a 30-year controls, so that 350 and then the 780 number I mentioned, a third of those are reassessed at 1 year, and the next third at the next year, and then there's a full reassessment in 3 years. And essentially, as I kind of mentioned earlier, what happens is that, you have an ISO that does all of this like massive work, they get locked away, and then they get like pulled out when there's a POAM or like something, they kind of or like a marionette, like stick figure that gets like paraded around, and then they get like, sent back away once that work is completed. Continuous authority to operate is saying like, hey, let's not do all of these kind of manual, performative exercise. And, for things like, should this version of this application move to production? We have our criteria defined in our pipeline. We have our rules set for vulnerability management, what our thresholds are that make sense for our risk posture, for things like malware scanning, making sure, those are null, but then also those tools are tuned appropriately. So we're not constantly responding to false positives. And we're making sure that if we get all of our green checks and we're good to go, then yes, this application's good to go. It doesn't need to really go through, this like massive process, because we've built the process already in our development processes. And maybe we need to get that development process approved as a part of cATO, but then that can be inherited and kind of leveraged by all the application teams that are actually building features and trying to serve value to users, whether that's in, healthcare for HHS and CMS, or, mission systems within the Department of Defense, or, kind of commercial aspects of like the, patent trademark office. It kind of differs depending on mission, but at the end of the day, it's all ice cream, just different flavors of ice cream.
I love that the centrality there, the ice cream, the noun, not the flavors, is data. And you were talking about the way that data is handled, not just in this like, hey, we're gonna put all the Excel's documents, we're gonna put all the policy and procedure docs, and then we're gonna sock them away for a year or 2 or 3. But we're using that in real time so that we're getting those green check marks. And if we're all greens, then everything is copacetic. We're rolling. That's getting a little bit like that makes my heart sing as a zero trust person. I'm like, yes, data, it's the central thing. Talk to us a little bit more about, break that down a bit more. Like, instead of looking at like, are we compliant because we have these things on file? We're compliant because we've engineered these automations to handle our data. Because ultimately, what we're looking at as GRC folks is the data compliant? Is the data safe? Are we following federal mandates for how the data is being used? How are you doing that in real time?
So I think maybe like a good like narrative here is focusing specifically on assessments. So I would say, I don't know if it's like spicy to say this, but like from what I've seen in the past, like traditional assessments, you enter an assessment, there's an assessor there that kind of just like, you go through your system security plan, which is like a big document of all, kind of the 782 line items, plus all of your policies and procedures, all the kind of, I'd say like 40 things that you have to put together for a full ATO package. And assessments that I've been in, they kind of just ask you like, hey, like AC2, that's your account management control for how you're governing account management. They'll just be like, what do you do for this? And then, you're like an ISO sitting there and you like essentially regurgitate back what's on the page and make sure you don't say anything extra or like, that's not included because that might be a finding. And then you just go through this like line by line. And it's like insane to me because there's nothing really happening through this process of value. It's just kind of, is this designated ISO or ISM person being able to regurgitate what they've put down on the page? Like that has no reflection or bearing on what's actually been deployed as a system. And so one of the things that we took a look at is like, how can we automate parts of the assessment, in a way that actually brings data to the forefront of this. And one of the tools that we found that can do this is AWS's Audit Manager. Since we were on we're on AWS for this particular system, we went through Audit Manager. We baked a custom assessment based off of, I guess, simply what Audit Manager does is it takes config rules that are AWS config rules that are put in place, AWS Security Hub packs. There's a few extra things that like APIs that can be configured, and it pulls all that data into any format. I think last time I checked, there's over 20 control frameworks within Audit Manager. We use NIST 853. We took that base NIST 853 assessment, pared it down to only the automated controls we needed, and we had about like 23% control coverage for our system security plan, which was great. And what we argued for them, and this is the really hard part, is arguing that this data that we are pulling is more valuable for these particular controls than kind of just like that performative, kind of traditional exercise. And this is extremely difficult for a number of reasons that we can get into or not get into. But essentially, like at its core, like it is like you're looking at, config rule checks, seeing green and red. And, for our the platform we were working on, we had more than one account, so if you have like a dozen accounts in like a given system, you might be able, as an assessor, you might be able to check one or two to make sure that like CloudTrail's on, like it said, it's like, spinning out data, that data is being ingested somewhere. But I know for a fact that like most assessment teams aren't checking that for every single account. And then not only that, you span that out to like every 782 controls. Like these are not being checked through every single account. We say that it is because it makes us feel safe that it is, and it makes us feel accomplished that it is. But if we introduce data into this process, we can actually look at like, what is this data telling us? And that can make actionable findings. Now, the key to this is doing this in a way that doesn't introduce a ton of noise into the system. I think that, just empathetically, traditional ATO processes, as long as they are, people are very sensitive about trying to compress timeframes. I think that is very hard to do in a traditional like manual sense in any way that like, I think you quickly start to realize that like you're doing it so quick that you're not really doing anything, but I don't think there's a whole lot of additional value from just taking a little bit longer to do it. So, I just said a lot there, but hopefully that Audit Manager example like kind of works. And then you have to apply that to the rest of the stack, right? Like pulling just data from your AWS infrastructure is great, but you also have to look at your application. You have to look at runtime. You have to look at like all of the different parts, like encryption. You have to kind of take like a comprehensive view at the system. I don't know how you do that without like really learning, how the system is actually engineered and kind of brushing up on some engineering chops yourself as a compliance person.
GRC folks, listen up. You have to learn the tech stacks. You have to be a little bit technical, at least. And that's so interesting, Lloyd, because our last guest last week, we were talking about quantum computing, amongst other things, but really the persistent threat that some of our federal systems are under against nation state attacks and how bombarded a lot of these federal agency systems are. So what you're doing is you're taking compliance, which is the theory, and you're making it real time. And you're saying, hey, not only do we have this documentation that says this is what we should be doing, this is how we're adhering to NIST 853, but we are real-time compliant right now, and we can see this in the most impactful ways to our system. That's pretty wild.
Yeah, that sparks a memory. So like pro tip for compliance people too. I guess it's helpful to say this now after the fact. I never really mentioned this like while it was happening. But compliance frameworks are extremely useful internal marketing tools for getting like certain initiatives that are like related to security engineering, cloud security, like the actual engineering work. A compliance framework is an extremely useful marketing tool to like sell like doing good security in a way that for some reason resonates in a way that like just advocating for strong security engineering practices doesn't seem to resonate as much. And so I think this is also a big part of kind of, you know, building rapport with the engineering teams is like, you know, there would be certain things where it's like, hey, you know, this is probably from a risk reduction standpoint, one of the most impactful things we can do. We just tied that to the compliance framework or like the appropriate control that it ties to. And then it's, well, we have to do this because it tells us to. You know, you can kind of use the nuance to interpret things in a more modern way, and you don't really have to stick to legacy things. Now, I will like a word of caution when doing this, like, yes, it's effective. From what I've seen, there's a bit of like an immune response from the traditional way that things are doing in a number of like this approach. And so, you know, there's certain things that are like baked in patterns to federal systems where it's like risk assessment, like, you know, maybe that's done by a particular tool and it always has been done by that tool and they like live and die by this tool. Like there's going to be a resistance when you say that you fulfill these risk assessment controls by these other tools. They may be far more modern, far more, you know, high fidelity, but you're going to have some resistance from people who are really, they hold a stake for whatever reason with the way things were.
Well, and how do you navigate? Like, you're really great at navigating through the
morass
naysayers. Yeah. So how do you navigate through those conversations to bring up the valid points in those conversations as a leader and saying like, no, this is really the way that we need to kind of progress and get that communicated to others that are in positions of making decisions?
I'm going to think about this.
That's a tough one.
I'm sorry.
I think the two things that come to mind are if you are always focused on the work and the actual outcomes, you can kind of navigate when there's that immune response comes up. You know, there might be like loud, you know, there might be loud opposition to a way of doing things, but if you've done your homework, like all you really need to do is kind of stand on that, and you can just like keep pointing back to like, you know, we've done the homework. You know, maybe they raised some like good points that you hadn't, you know, learned originally, and it can be annoying in the moment, but then you just kind of add it to the body of work. You know, you figure things out, and then you just like keep, you know, answering questions. And I'd say like the second thing that comes to mind is just like, I've always been astonished with how well like just listening to someone seems to work. Like sometimes people actually don't care too much what they're talking about. And they don't really have as much of a dog in the fight as you'd think. They just want to be listened to. And so if you know, kind of listen to them, you know, pull apart and I mean like really listen to, like there's a lot of, I think I try and lean into this maybe too much sometimes, but like really listen to what they're saying, take it to heart, and then, you know, maybe you just take it to heart and then set it aside, and then you just kind of move forward. But, you know, maybe they have some like a nugget in there too that you didn't really think that could be useful for like down the line that you know, make sure to address in whatever initiative it is that you're trying to move forward. I think those two things have really helped me. I'd have to think a little bit more for some of the other stuff. I'd say it's all just like it's work too. There's this like weird like approach in security that like security people just, you know, are constantly like waking up at night, you know, in cold sweats worried about their like systems. And I'm not saying to like not take your job like very seriously, but at the same time, you know, there's it's similar to fitness, right? Like in order to kind of like be like a resilient person, right? You don't have to be working out 24 hours a day. That's actually extremely counterproductive to being like fit and resilient. But if you've done kind of the, you know, three things, whether it's like drinking water, you know, you got your workout in, whether it's like 10 minutes, whether it's 20, whether it's, you know, 2 hours. And then, you know, you're getting just kind of the right, you know, roughly like the right macros or whatever, like diet that you're looking at, you can be like relatively confident that like you're going to be sick less than I really like cosmic brownies. You can be pretty confident that you're going to be like more healthy and resilient in that case than if you're just eating a ton of cosmic brownies that I really like want to do. And it's like a similar approach for like security, right? Like if you've gotten up, you've like done the tasks in your day that you need to do to be able to like move the bar forward in like a secure manner, and you're like advocating for that. You've done your homework, you're like listening to the people around you, and you're like still kind of I'd say like remaining like confident in like yourself and your team and kind of moving forward. That like really helps with a lot of the I would say like dealing with a lot of like people who might be like very resistant or even outright combative or antagonistic to what you're trying to do.
I love that. Got to eat your Wheaties and then you can weather the storm. Something that you said earlier, I think is worth kind of circling back to. And it sort of ties into what you were just saying as well. And that's the idea of the compliance person. And I'm gonna lump GRC or governance and risk in with compliance, because that's the way everybody sees GRC people anyway, right? The compliance person being that enabler, because they understand like the hoops that you have to jump through. Like this is what we have to do. But also if you've eaten your Wheaties and you've done your homework and you know the technical, the tech stack or the tech background or the tools or the options, you're suddenly that connector that can creatively problem solve. And when you're listening to people and you're hearing their needs and their complaints and their shortcomings, you're able to offer solutions that are also vetted already through your technical team. That's pretty unique. I don't know that there's a lot of compliance folks that are thinking like that, or technical engineering folks that are thinking about compliance in that way. But it is, that's a transformational flavor, I think. Here, I have the keys to the kingdom. Like here's this marketing framework. We can say that we are green checks across the board on all of this. That is going to make us look great. It is going to keep all of the regulators out of our hair, and we can have a nice smooth run. I don't know that is necessarily the conversation or the context that conversations around compliance are happening. That's really exciting and impactful.
I appreciate that. I agree.
Yeah.
So, what are some like challenges or considerations when like adopting continuous ATOs that you would take into consideration before even like looking at potentially going down the continuous ATO path or not for an organization or for an agency even?
Yep, I would say executive alignment, kind of stakeholder alignment from the kind of whether if it's I guess in the federal government, whoever your executive stakeholders are, whoever your federal stakeholders are, having a shared buy-in for the vision is massive and will like very much help at the onset, unblock any kind of resistances. I think one thing I've noticed just in general working in software in the federal government is like change in any context is usually met with a resistance, either from competing incentives where a federal contract won by a new company, like we don't know this company, we don't know these people, like they're new, they're strange, unfamiliar, what are they going to do? There's all these like natural reactions that people have, and especially in a continuous authority operate sense, there might even be like legitimate concerns of, oh, you're going to come in and maybe like automate my job, or at the very least like automate it in a way that I no longer am able to like be confident and familiar. A lot of the traditional ATO processes, there's a whole vast amount of people working in the space who have all of that down cold. They can walk into an assessor or an ISO position. They know kind of how to get their traditional CDEs from a scanner. They know how to work traditional GRC tools. And all of a sudden you're saying like, no, you have to basically self-teach yourself an engineering discipline, build things, do things a totally different way. Now you're no longer looking at just a standard SSP and assessment. Now you're pulling in, like auto manager data. Maybe you have to like go through a console. Maybe there's a report. We're talking vulnerability management done slightly differently, looking at different feeds than just a 1 to 10 score. all of that is like a very understandable, like, fear of the unknown. And I would actually say that a lot of that fear has like driven me towards the path of GRC engineering. I've never wanted to be the compliance person that's like left in the dust. And so, I just kind of looked around and see it and I'm like, all right, like this is what the work is now. So, here I go. And so I think that, there's a lot of empathy that can be had, but also, there's the executive kind of the buy-in really helps, and I think I've seen a lot of really like positive leaning in from folks across agencies towards cATO, which is really good to see.
Right, because it's security and it's cost savings and it's centralization, and those are things that everybody wants. It's just scary getting there because it does involve venturing off of the established path into something kind of new.
Yep.
Natalie, and I'm actually going to pose a question to Natalie really quick. Sorry, Lloyd.
Oh.
Because you work a lot with FedRAMP, which is sort of the monolith, the big brother to continuous
Terrible
cATO.
one.
And it's like, yeah, I mean, it's as big
It's a
and
giant.
unwieldy and long as possible. And I know the work that you do is probably more rooted in traditional GRC, but you're also able to look towards what like cATO brings to some of these agencies that are adopting it. What is your hot take when you think about FedRAMP and you think about this? I guess what some folks could say is like a leaner, meaner, lighter version of federal authority to operate. Give me Natalie's hot take on this.
Yeah, I think that like the aspect of having solid continuous monitoring processes, configuration management, change management processes, your incident response process, all your processes have to be solid and they have to be well documented, well defined. And like, even for example, like I can say you have to have a well documented, well defined incident response plan. You could give me 10 different incident response plans and they could all be well documented or defined for a specific organization, but it still doesn't they're not all going to tell you that in this case, we're going to do this now. And in this situation, we're going to do this now, but they give you enough of a general sense. You have to get all those processes. And to me, really, really in sync, because as soon as you can start to tie your technical requirements or your assessment requirements into those processes, the more likely that an organization is actually following through and actually continuously doing those processes on a monthly basis, because they can create these automated tickets that open up every month or every quarter or every 6 months and tell them, hey, you need to go look at this document, or hey, you need to go do this, or you need to go do that. So that's kind of my hot take, is getting your processes really, really cemented. But then also from the agency side, I think that they have to really be able to appropriately monitor all the continuous monitoring that is actually happening. So
which is a challenge, because that's a lot. That's a lot to do. Very cool. So
Natalie, I have a question for Natalie. What is what do you think is like one of some of the most typical, I don't know if I want to say shortcoming, but I guess gap that you usually see amongst customers trying to seek an ATO, whether through FedRAMP or through an agency?
Sometimes, so it depends. I've had a couple different customers that have had different problems. So I've had some that just they didn't have anything documented and they didn't know enough of that portion or that specialty of having that implemented into their technical capability. They were definitely just a developer and wanted to do that. So trying to get them to understand that you have to invest in your team, that was kind of a hard sell sometimes. But then on the flip side, I've had customers that their processes, they are very well ingrained and they are continuously. So it's just making those minor tweaks. And a lot of times, whenever you go throughout an assessment and hear an auditor, I always tell my team, hey guys, sometimes, especially when you're junior in GRC, I think you think of, you think of these plan documents as being rigid. For example, configuration management only deals with the CM control family, whereas in reality, you could have MA tying into the CM control family through certain controls, right? You could have, RA controls with your vulnerabilities being remediated within a certain time frame. That can also tie into it. So you have to kind of think of it in more of a flow methodology. And as you're going through those assessments, picking up on keywords like, how are you auditing? Oh, auditing. Can we maybe tie this into our SEAM and create a report that we need or something like that,
And then
What about
aligning
you?
those things under these like automated capabilities to say like, okay, not only is, maybe MA and one other controller related, but in fact, there's a whole list of these controls that are, met by one automated process, which takes you to that more like that cATO. It's all coming together.
And it's really nice when you have the software, like the tools available to you as an organization to actually like be able to do that with the integrations that exist, like without having to like kind of engineer and kind of finesse some interconnections to working together for your system or building it within, off of like open source tools. It is a lot easier when you have a tool that how it kind of works. You kind of know how to automate it out nicer. So there are some pros and cons there as well that I've seen that like with companies that can afford like the tools and the right tool set, like it's 10 times faster because it just automatically pops up and opens up the ticket.
For sure. What does the future of this look like? So, in some ways, Natalie, I love that you're talking about, the different ways that this more traditional authority to operate in FedRAMP is already kind of evolving. Lloyd, what you're doing with cATO is sort of the next iteration of that in a lighter way. What are we looking at as we're looking ahead? We know that this industry is evolving at breakneck pace. What comes next to continue to marry compliance and security so that compliant systems are secure systems? What's on the horizon?
I'll give my happy take and then I'll give my jaded take. I think the happy take. So like in an ideal future. You almost don't have to do any kind of like Excel, PDF, Word document type exercises or activities anymore. In an ideal world, you would have 100% of your RMF kind of responsibilities baked into your system architecture. Your data feeds for every single control are connected to a more modern GRC system that has like API integrations. There's a framework called OSCAL, which is an as code framework to develop system security plans. Let's say that, like RA5, for example, which is the risk assessment control for conducting it's very like broad essentially, but it's like how you're doing like your not just your vulnerability management, but kind of how you're conducting risk assessments in general. That control would be fed by a number of data feeds from like maybe Security Hub if you're using AWS, Inspector, all of your maybe like your runtime scanning, for runtime security, your pipeline security results. You have like a dashboard, and ISO can come in and they can basically see 99% green for all of your 780 control elements, and then decisions are basically made at the release level. Every time you kind of you have new feature release or kind of like a patch or a fix rolled out, you already know in real time your overall risk posture at every level of the stack. I think that the way cATO is implemented now is that kind of with a bunch of things stitched together to make that happen. I think in an ideal world, we'd have like very seamless integrations, and you'd actually abstract away a lot of compliance in general. I think that kind of transitions to my second take. All of that like ideal future takes actual work by practitioners right now. And that work, has to be competed with the opportunity cost of doing other work. Right now, AI is the hot thing. Maybe we get AGI and AGI tells us all to do something. I have no idea what will happen on that route. But like maybe we plateau and maybe we, go to the next hot thing. And then, we're working there. I think that the pain though from current traditional GRC processes will always kind of I think a GRC engineering approach will always like outdo the traditional way of doing things, no matter how simple you get. And so I think that there's opportunity there in kind of the now and then the near just real future. I would say I don't know if this is like jaded, maybe just more like realistic. I don't see federal policy moving in a direction anytime soon that would like mandate and support the actual like commercial will to build all of this ideal future at the moment. And so there's always going to, I guess like what I'm trying to say is there's always going to be like some level of like manual approach. I think that you'll find in, it depends on the federal agency. Some are more forward leaning than others and are really making efforts to move towards that fully automated future. And I think those agencies will find the most success within their compliance programs in the future. But it's not going to be, the full kind of federal government and like all moving together. I think that'll be like pockets that do it really well, and then pockets that maybe don't do it as well. So we'll see with some of the kind of additional frameworks that are coming out, and we'll see where things go.
Do you think that like you said there are certain agencies that'll move forward with it a little bit faster? There's some that'll move a little bit slower. Like, do you think that like DoD is kind of like sitting on that faster side in your opinion, or on the slower side in your opinion, just out of curiosity?
That really depends on the program.
Okay.
It depends on the authorizing official that's involved, what that kind of person's tone, their vision is. I would say that like I don't think I can answer that question for the full DoD without like stepping in something. I would say it just really depends on like the program. I definitely I've worked at some that have been extremely far ahead, kind of the tip of the spear, and then I've also worked in some that really struggled. And I guess to that point, I would say that. For GRC, for aspiring GRC professionals particularly, it is not an impossible ask to just, I would say, master a NIST 853 and be able to get a system through an ATO, I would even argue like with a small team, maybe not by yourself, but like with a small team, it is not an impossible ask to like master that very, very quickly. And I would say that should be one of your first goals, if it isn't already, is to be like familiar enough with the full extent of NIST 853 to be able, and familiar enough with the tech stack of like whatever given system you're using, get a system through assessment. And then, once you have that down cold to be able to survive the manual processes anywhere you go, then you can start to really speed up your own workflow and help yourself by introducing some of those GRC engineering capabilities. And you'll start to realize that there's a lot of like overlapping patterns, whichever agency you're at.
Because there's pockets that are easier to bring engineering into early, especially. And then it's just getting that coverage until you've got a nice blanket. Awesome.
Okay. Well, I know you kind of already gave your final take, Lloyd. I'm going to give Mac her chance to give a final take. I'll give you another chance to give any last final takes because Mac kind of asked a question. And then we'll take it away. Go ahead, Mac.
Awesome. So as the zero trust person here that started in GRC and zero trust is kind of this weird amalgamation of GRC and engineering. I think that like this process of GRC engineering and the process of GRC automation is super exciting. It's all about how centralized can we make this. We're seeing this already in the tooling that we're building with seams and SOARs. I like to use those as like our tiny little metaphors. You two know, and everyone that knows me knows I love my metaphors, right? Can we bring automation and engineering into GRC so that the entire practice kind of operates like a seam or a SOAR, where we're basing our automations on really robust policy that's based on frameworks. It's happening leveraging the newest tech, and we're allowing a smaller group of humans to make better informed decisions in real time. I just think this is the new hotness, and it's awesome to hear it from the horse's mouth, Lloyd, as the memes are, and one of the OG GRC engineering guys. Natalie, to you.
Well, actually, to Lloyd. Hot takes, Lloyd.
Hot takes. I don't know if I have any hot takes left, but maybe this is close to one. I think to succeed, the best way I could describe this is if you were like a software development background person, or you have like strong like security engineering, and you just like switched into a GRC role, you would instantly rise. Provided you could stomach the kale, you would instantly rise to like the top of the field. And I would just use that as an example for like GRC specific folks to say, like, if that's the case, then like that engineering, growing that kind of engineering, being able to understand and stomach the compliance parts, and then also being able to socialize all of this, so you're not like constantly just working in silos. You're actually getting you're deploying your kind of tools and capabilities alongside the engineering team, then you will also like rise just as quickly. And that's kind of how I would describe it there. And I think I've seen that play out like very successfully. I've seen a lot of resistance to that, but I think, again, going back to the work, if you're just like constantly like working in this direction, like good things will come.
Yeah. Awesome. From the cATO side of things, I cannot wait till one day when we don't actually have to do these like, million documents and just create them all ourselves and like by hand. When we have such great tools out there to help us like do our jobs better, why waste the time? But at the same time, like you're going to still have to tweak in certain aspects of policy or procedure at any point in time, or a plan document, especially if you're not building from scratch. But I do look forward to the day where like we're not constantly just feel like we're running in circles like a little hamster, because that's kind of how it feels like, oh, we just got through our assessment. And then, oh, by the way, yeah, now in 6 months, we have to start getting ready for our next assessment. And it's just a constant wheel. And especially when you're running on a tight ship, it can be very difficult for a lot of small companies. So that is what my hot take is. With that being said, thank you so much, Lloyd, for hopping in. We had a great conversation. And we will be back in a few weeks. We are actually going to be taking a break for the holidays, and we will be back probably with one episode, I think, in December left, and then back in the new year. So we will chat at you all later. Have a good one.
Thanks, Lloyd.
Thank you, Mac. Thank you, everyone.